Darcy would never believe that about her. Yeah, I got started writing a Pride and Prejudice sequel before I knew there was a whole cottage industry out there writing Jane Austen fan fiction. I guess I'm just corny enough to believe there is like one true story, and Jane Austen wrote it.
Hello. Today I'm talking to Shannon Winslow. This is part of the Regency history series of interviews with authors of fiction and non-fiction who write about Jane Austen around the period of Jane Austen. Some of them are writing Jane Austen fan fiction, Jane Austen spin-offs, but also writing other novels as well, romances and other types of stories, all set in the Regency era or around that time. So the late 18th century, early 19th century. And so today I'm talking to Shannon Winslow. So Shannon, thank you for joining me.
Glad to be here.
And Shannon's in the US, 8 hours different from me. So it's quite late in the evening for me, and it's about lunchtime for you.
Right.
And talk about Jane Austen. So Jane Austen very much features in your sort of writing. Tell us a bit about what it is that you write, Shannon.
Oh, well, yeah, I got started writing a Pride and Prejudice sequel before I knew there was a whole cottage industry out there writing Jane Austen fan fiction. And it's just gone from there. Just loved the writing as well as Jane Austen, which got me started and inspired in the first place. And since then, I've gotten a total of 11 novels and plus a Jane Austen devotional written and published. And so it's just been wonderful having a new and exciting career at this stage in my life, really.
Wow, that's cool. I mean, I was looking at some of the reviews that are on Amazon for some of your books. You've got 11 books on there, which is great, and some of them are audio books as well now, aren't they? As well as being obviously print and Kindle. So things like Shannon Winslow did a great job of recreating the characters of Mary and Kitty. So that's Mary and Kitty from Pride and Prejudice, and taking them to a new level of maturity.
Ah. Lovely.
And another reviewer says, I think Jane Austen will be happy that someone has continued the story of her excellently contrived characters. I'm so sorry that I got to the end so quickly.
Yeah, well, that is something that's a little bit different about what I do than what a lot of authors do. I do remain true to canon. All my stories are adding on to what Jane Austen has written, not changing it. I guess I'm just corny enough to believe there is like one true story, and Jane Austen wrote it. so nothing against anyone who does anything else, but for me, it just works best if I, stick to what's in canon and add on. So I've got sequels, and some of the books are part prequel and minor character stories and hero point of view, that sort of thing, but adding on to, not changing.
So would you call your work fan fiction? Would you call it historical fiction? Would you call it something else entirely?
Well, I think it's more in the realm of fan fiction because it's specifically targeted at people who already love Jane Austen stories and know her stories. So that's, even though I kind of resisted that title for a while, it fits. I just say I'm writing for the fans of Jane Austen. That's what I like to describe it as.
That's great. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's my encouragement to anybody is if you want to write something, start writing. I mean, I know that my early writing career, when I was, very young as a child, I was writing very derivative stuff, copying other people's stories effectively. But whatever gets you going, and then obviously what you're doing particularly is you're taking characters, often minor characters, I think, from Jane Austen's work, and then taking their stories forward.
You think of her novels as so complete in themselves, but when you start looking, there are a lot of blanks. Things we don't know about her characters, what happened before, what happened after, what was Mr. Darcy doing all the time that he was off the page.
Yes.
And that sort of just fascinates me. I just start thinking about that, and just a whole creative process begins, and I just have a wonderful time filling in all those blanks.
So let's talk a bit about research, because obviously these interviews from the Regency history side are very much focused on research. How much research do you do when you're sitting down to write one of these novels?
Yeah, I was amazed you wanted to even interview me because I freely admit research is not my favorite part of the writing process. I love the story and following where that takes me. And sometimes I'll be writing and really in the flow of the story, and then I'll run into something and realize, I don't know, I have to stop and do research. So it's like a roadblock taking me on a detour and interrupting the flow of the story. That's, the way I write. Of course, the logical thing to do would be to research the things you need to know before you start writing. But since I don't plot my books, I don't know what I'm going to need to know until I get there. And but the plus side is that sometimes I'll discover new things when I do have to stop and do research. I'll discover something new that ends up making the story more interesting, or takes it in a new direction. So that's kind of the plus. The one book that I have written that's not strictly a Jane Austen spin-off, as you might call it, is For Myself Alone. And it's a totally independent story in a Jane Austen style. And for that book, I needed to know something about the breach of promise suits. And strangely enough, that's never mentioned in a Jane Austen book. So I had to go do some research, and it was quite a bit different than I expected. So that was an interesting challenge to not go in the direction that I was planning on, but to go in the direction that made it fit the facts. And so that worked out well. Anyway, as far as my research, basically I do just enough to hopefully not make any terrible significant errors in fact, and not too much beyond. And I, in some ways I think I have good precedent for that, because Jane Austen did not go into a tremendous amount of detail. She didn't what we would call period details at this point. She didn't talk about, what are the servants up to, and what type of carriage and how far could you go before you had to change horses, and what the furnishings looked like. She was fairly minimal in her descriptions. And so I have that as my precedent that I'm going to claim. So, basically my research starts right here. What I call my Jane Austen Bible. It's well used and dog-eared and marked with pages, and what I need to know, most of it's in there.
Yeah, you brought up some interesting thoughts there, Shannon. I mean, again, there's no rights and wrongs when it comes to research. I mean, Jane Austen was, as you say, she put very little detail into her writing about the period she was in, because she was writing contemporary novels.
Exactly.
She was writing about the time she was in.
Right.
So she didn't need to describe things like carriages, and she didn't need to give period detail to help it feel Regency, because her audience was in that era, or the audience she was immediately writing for. Obviously, she didn't perhaps realize she'd be writing for people who'd be reading it 200 years later.
I'm sure she couldn't imagine.
So obviously, people trying to write Regency novels or Jane Austen-esque novels, or fan fiction, that sort of thing, there's a sort of sense of, I need to put some historical detail in there so the reader knows that it's set in that time period. So that's an immediate difference.
Yeah, but I think the people who read these novels, they read them because they love the time period. So and if they're reading a Jane Austen spinoff, they know it's taken place in Regency. I don't have to tell them that, but they're very knowledgeable too. So that is the difficulty, is that I do have to try to avoid those errors, because they'll know it if I say something really stupid.
With any novel, what's really important, of course, is the story, isn't it? It's not actually the detail. I mean, when someone's reading a novel and something crops up that trips them up. So for example, an example I often use is when someone describes the fact that they're walking down a road in England and they see a chipmunk. Now, there are novels that have that in, and I know other authors have told me they've made a similar mistake. You know, they've had raccoons running wild in the English countryside and that sort of thing. And of course, there are
You
no
don't have those, huh?
there were no chipmunks, and there still are. Actually, apparently there are now wild chipmunks in some
Oh,
parts of the UK, but they're much more recent immigrants,
yeah.
escaped pets and that sort of thing. But back in Jane Austen's time, there were no chipmunks, there were no raccoons, there were no beavers. I think, beavers. There used to be beavers in the England, but they were long extinct. There were no wild bears. Not that I think anyone's made the mistake of putting a roaming bear into a Jane Austen-esque novel. There are these little mistakes. If someone puts a mistake in like that, then that can trip up some readers. But what readers really, of course, really want, and I'm sure you'll agree, is they want a good story.
Yeah, that's focus. And so I try to, put in enough detail to set the stage or create a mood. But that's about it, pretty minimalistic. Well, yeah, and sometimes you can actually, when you said trip up the reader, that's something I've thought a lot about and run into before. And sometimes they will trip and stumble over something that's actually correct, and they think it's an error. And that's a problem too. Sometimes, like Jane Austen in Pride and Prejudice, there's a room at Pemberley that she calls the saloon, and she says it twice, so it's not a typo. And but I was criticized by one reviewer because surely I meant a salon, not a saloon. Saloons are taverns in the wild, wild west. And but it was correct, but technically correct, but it stumbled the reader, so it still wasn't a good thing.
That's interesting. That's interesting. So I would like to talk a bit about the research that you do. Now, you've said, Shannon, you don't do a massive amount, and you do it sort of on demand as opposed to your work being research driven. So let's talk about the research that you did for that novel that you wrote when you talked about researching breach of promise. So tell me, how did you approach that?
Well, I started by going to my library to see what sources they might have, and I came up with a good source. I started a long time ago now, so it's hard to remember whether that was what book that was. But anyway, learned some interesting things and was able to incorporate them into the story. And it most people think of the breach of promise as something that was brought by a woman against a man. But what I learned through the research was that it was early on in that phenomenon, it was just as often brought by a man against a woman if she broke off their engagement, because he may have borrowed money against the expectation of inheriting if she was a rich woman, and then he could be in a real bind if she broke it off.
What sort of internet resources do you use for research, if you use any at all?
Yeah, well, I have a couple of books that I have just about general Regency life. I can look up, what card games they played, or what does a barouche look like, and that sort of thing. But if I need something further than that, I do usually go to the internet. I check the library, and usually there's nothing helpful there about something so specific, But there's great websites run by people who do love the research. And so I'm happy to take advantage of all this information they're sharing with the rest of us. So I've got a couple sites I go to, Nancy Mayer, Regency researcher, and then Mariah Grace has a great one called Random Myths of Fascination. She's got a whole Regency life index there. Another thing I found online that's been really helpful to me, because of what I write, that I'm writing, adding on to Jane Austen stories, you can find timelines that people have put together by all the clues that Jane Austen left in her book about who was born when, and she'll mention something small and they'll say, oh, well, that means that so-and-so was born in that same year. And they've put together a timeline for all the novels about, what took place when.
Yeah.
So when I'm adding on, especially before the story began, it's really helpful to have that all laid out so I don't accidentally contradict something, because I'm trying so hard to not contradict anything in canon.
Yeah, that must be a challenge keeping up with all the details that are in the Jane Austen. Although her books are all standalone, aren't they? It's not like you've got a series where you've got
True.
facts which roll on next to. And she was writing contemporary fiction, so therefore canon for her, I guess, was life at the time, basically.
Well, and I've often wondered, did she stop and figure it out? I mean, other people have figured it out after the fact, what the timeline was exactly, but did she stop and figure out
Yeah.
the exact timeline, so she made sure she didn't contradict herself? Because that's tricky enough to do when you're writing a book. You may have run into that too, where, oh, I have to remember what color his hair is because, or their eyes. I guess eyes are notorious for changing colors during a novel.
Yeah, absolutely. Those details do change. I think Jane Austen, from what I know of her writing, spent a lot of time discussing her plots and things with her family.
Yeah.
So I think she was getting a lot of input, and probably to what extent they were reading drafts, I don't know. But I suspect she had some editors to some degree already on hand who could point it out. You do know that actually that person's changed their hair color or whatever.
Well, she does have, what's the air she has? She has, I think, apple trees blooming in the fall, the autumn. And I did make that mistake in my first book, The Darcys of Pemberley. I said fall when I should have said autumn, of course. But anyway, but yeah, it's reassuring to know that even Jane Austen had mistakes. She had apple trees blooming in the autumn instead of the spring.
I didn't know that, so that's an interesting one.
I think it's an Emma. I'd have to.
Okay, that's a little gem to look up.
Right.
I mean, I don't know. Is there a website which is basically the mistakes that Jane Austen made?
Probably, but I haven't looked for it.
Or maybe there weren't enough of them to merit a whole website. Maybe that's the only.
I think she was pretty sharp.
So I was going to ask you about any mistakes that you'd made that you were willing to sort of admit to, and there is one. Are there anything else? Yeah. Is there anything else?
Oh, I didn't put chipmunks in England, but it seems like there was something. Oh, bears. You said no bears.
Yes.
But people would have known what bears were.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. And there would have been bears in England at the time, but they wouldn't have been wild. There'd have been captive bears. And typically by that point, they'd have been brought in from the continent. I'm not sure what the date was for the last wild bear being killed in England. But it was certainly well before the time of Jane Austen.
Yeah. Well, I did include a story. Well, it's a child telling a story about a bear. So as long as children would have known what bears were, then I'm not mistaken there.
Children would have known what bears were. Yes. Yeah. Bears and wolves.
We have them prowling in our garbage cans right here, right now, but not in England, sadly. You don't have to worry about that.
And do your readers ever point out to you where something isn't? Well, you've already mentioned that some readers have picked up on things that weren't actually mistakes. So I'm guessing that answer to that question is yes, your readers do point out to you where they think something's gone wrong.
I guess I tend to remember the ones that they're incorrect about instead of my own errors. But a lot of things are problems because of word usage that has changed. Like the word intimate. I got in trouble with some of my readers for using the word intimate, describing how, that Elizabeth had once had a rather intimate relationship with Mr. Wickham. And they came back with, she never would have, Darcy would never believe that about her. But, Jane Austen uses the word intimate, hundreds of times probably, and not one of them has anything to do with sexual interaction. Well, and intercourse is the same kind of problem.
Well, I make love. People are often making love in at that time, but it's just in the general sense of relationship. It's nothing intimate.
Yeah, well, there's songs out of the 40s, 1940s that it is, where they're speaking of making love to their sweetheart, and they're just, they're dating, they're wooing them. They're not.
Absolutely, yes. Yes. it's soft words and that sort of stuff, and that's about it. Something else that I picked up from one of your reviews is this, and it says, I guess what's missing for me, so this is someone writing about your work, I guess what's missing for me is something that no modern author can reproduce. So they're not criticizing you, they're pointing out, and this is the sense of time, place, and the knowledge that comes from exactly how these people would behave and what social pressure they would have been under. I don't think it's possible for a writer in our day to capture that delicious sense of satire that Jane Austen delivered so well.
Well, I won't argue with that. I can't claim to be as brilliant as Jane Austen, number one. And obviously she had the advantage of knowing that period so well. And I do my best to write in the same tone and the same spirit, but no, I cannot match.
Well, no, we can't, can we? And I think one of the challenges for authors is that, and I'm interested to know how you feel about this, but is that the romantic heroes, so the Mr. Darcys and people like that, their attitudes to some things, such as the position of women, maybe such as slavery and that sort of thing, would be quite different for many of them than our attitudes today. And if you're going to be historically accurate, well, how do you handle that from a historical accuracy point of view? This is what the person's talking about, I think, in this comment, is that our attitudes are so different from theirs. To be historically accurate would be, to some people, I think, would actually be quite offensive.
Yes, exactly. And I think you're correct. It's always a balancing act to try to balance being historically accurate with not offending modern sensibilities. And I guess I would err on the side of being historically accurate, but I've got a friend who she could never like Mr. Darcy. You know, I was watching the 6-hour Pride and Prejudice with her with Colin Firth, and you know, I'd seen it 100 times before, but she'd never seen it, and so I was so excited to share it with her. And she didn't like Mr. Darcy, you know, at the beginning. I said, "Oh, well, wait till the end," you know. And, you know, she never could warm up to him. And I think it was because he was such a snob, and some, you know, those class distinctions that we can't really understand now. She could never get past that, really. You know, you have to leave some of that in the hands of the reader, I think. Their responsibility too, not just the writer's responsibility to make it work.
Absolutely. And no story and no story style is going to appeal to everybody. You're all going to find your audience. We'll all find our audience somewhere. So how do you handle that in the books that you've written? How do you handle things like class and those class distinctions? Because obviously there's quite a wide gulf in things like Pride and Prejudice. I mean, you're dealing with the middle classes with the Bennets, and you've got the upper classes with the Darcys and the Bingleys. So yeah, to what extent do you how does that play into what you write?
Well, as I say, I'm mostly adding on to the stories that are already existing. So I'm not creating a lot of new social groups that I have to sort out who's who and who's above who and all that. It's already pretty well established. I also don't go along with the craze about creating an awful lot of, you know, dukes and earls that are handsome and unattached and willing to marry commoners. So you know, I don't have that wide range of social classes. Much like Jane Austen, she wasn't talking about the servants. She wasn't talking about the lower classes. You know, there's a few humble people like Miss Bates in her novels, but mostly she's talking about people within a fairly narrow range. You know, Lady Catherine de Bourgh is about as high as we go, and she's, you know, the daughter of an earl. So I really haven't had to deal with anything beyond what Jane Austen already established for me. I haven't really had to sort that out for myself.
Yeah. So in terms of the sort of thing that you read, I mean, do you read historical fiction, or do your own sort of personal reading tastes go in a completely different direction?
I read a variety of things. I do like Regency romance stories. But I do love things from that period. And I don't read a lot of Jane Austen fan fiction, other people's stories connected with Jane Austen's work. I don't really want to be influenced accidentally by what somebody else has written. And also, like I said, I really like to stay with the one true story and I'm not really interested in a lot of variations, a bad Jane Bennet and a vampire Mr. Darcy just doesn't appeal to me. That appeal, there's an audience for everybody, as you said a minute ago.
Absolutely. So in terms of future writing, I mean, I believe you aspired to write something which came out of all of Jane Austen's 6 different works. So you've written obviously some stuff around Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility, and some others. Remind me which other ones you've written.
I have more books on Pride and Prejudice than anything else. That's the most popular book, and so those are my most popular books as well, the ones that are Pride and Prejudice books. But yes, I do want to write at least one novel based on each of her 6. And I've got a persuasion. It's called The Persuasion of Miss Jane Austen. And that one, Jane Austen is actually the main character, but it's like the story behind the story. I've made up what I consider a plausible alternative outcome for her, where she gets this romance and happy ending that all her heroines get. And it's all based on the story of Persuasion.
Persuasion, yes.
Yeah. And then I have Murder at Northanger Abbey. So kind of a campy murder mystery.
Yeah, that one intrigues me. I have to say that one intrigues me. I'll have to have a look at that at some point.
Yeah, it was fun. It's very tongue in cheek, as the original novel was too. And then I've got Colonel Brandon in his own words. So that's my Sense and Sensibility book, at least so far. And so the only one I have left is Emma, and that's what I'm trying to work on now. I'm trying to do a Mr. Knightley in his own words. So I'll have three hero point of view books: Darcy, Colonel Brandon, and Mr. Knightley when I finish this one.
Did I miss Mansfield Park? Where was that in there?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm glad you asked, because yes, I wasn't counting. I consider this one, Leap of Hope, as my Mansfield Park homage. It's a modern girl, goes back in time.
Okay, time travel. Yeah.
Yes. So yes, I like to try new things. Murder mystery. I've never written one before. So what? I can do that. And time travel, why not? Anyway, she goes back in time looking for her Mr. Darcy, but she ends up, instead of finding herself in a Pride and Prejudice story, she ends up finding herself in a Mansfield Park story. It was so much fun, and I think it's a fun book. If somebody said, "Well, which book of yours is the most fun?" I'd go with either the Murder at Northanger Abbey or Leap of Hope.
Right, yeah. So, in terms of writing anything beyond the Jane Austen sequels, have you got any aspirations to do that?
Well, I do have. It's actually the 3rd book I wrote, and it would be, like part of the series, not a series, excuse me, a collection with I've got Leap of Hope, which we just talked about, but I've also got Leap of Faith, which is a modern, non-Jane Austen story about, of all things, a minor league baseball player. And he does a little time traveling himself. And I actually wrote that book 3rd. I didn't publish it until later, but I'd written 2 books, The Darcys of Pemberley and For Myself Alone. And I was awaiting publication, and I thought, well, I was so in love with the writing process by then. I thought, if this, the whole Jane Austen thing doesn't work out, what else would I be interested in writing? And that's how I got started on writing Leap of Faith, because it's a what if book. If you could go back in time and change something in your life, how would that affect the outcome, kind of a story. So, and then the whole Jane Austen thing did sort of work out. It sort of started snowballing, and so I never got back to writing anything other than Jane Austen to this point.
So are you tempted to tackle the one that Jane Austen started but didn't finish?
Oh, Well, which one, Watson's or Sanditon?
Well, both.
Well, I went so far as naming a character Mr. Sanditon in well, that's in the first book, Darcy Pemberley. But no, I have not, and especially now that they've been Sanditon has been, written and filmed, and I think it would be strange to go back and try to write a new ending to that book. I mean, there's just a little fragment, but no.
Yes.
The short answer to your question is no, I have not been tempted.
I haven't been tempted. I mean, Sanditon, I mean, yes, I think it's fair to say that the television series of Sanditon doesn't stick very closely to probably to Jane Austen's ideals for how a book would develop. So I think there's scope there, and I'm particularly interested in Sanditon because we live in Weymouth, which is a seaside resort, not that far from the sort of areas that Jane Austen was thinking of when she created that whole idea of somebody developing a fashionable seaside resort. So I'd be intrigued to see that done really well. I believe that there is there is another, I don't believe there is on our bookshelf another version of Sanditon, which was apparently finished off by, it's called Another Lady, and my wife's read it a few times, and apparently she got her information from the Austen family, who sort of, these were the stories that Jane Austen was playing with. So her version
I've heard it's good. I haven't read it, but I've heard it's good. So if it's already been done well, then I don't really have much temptation.
But there's other minor characters that you could take in other directions. Anyway,
possibilities are endless.
Yes, absolutely. So, do you publish yourself, or do you have a publisher? How does that work for you, Shannon?
Yes, I'm independently published, and that's worked out really well for me. So
that's good.
I did have an agent at one point in time. I was waiting for the call from New York, and it didn't quite get there. And kind of thinking it might have worked out for the best after all, because it's the way things are done now. So
we're certainly big advocates of the whole independent publishing, self-publishing, whatever you want to call it. Publishing has changed massively over the last 20 or 30 years, and will continue to change. I think.
No doubt.
I think we'll see many more.
I love the audiobook trend. I think that's just wonderful, and I'm glad to have all but one of my books are in audio too.
Yes, I'd seen that, and that's going well for you.
Yes. Well, it may overtake Kindle pretty soon as far as number of sales.
Thank you for giving me some time today, Shannon, and it's been interesting to talk to you and to get some insights into your process. If you were speaking to another writer who was thinking of, I'm thinking about writing Regency, I'm thinking about writing Jane Austen fan fiction, something like that, what would your tips be to somebody who was in that situation?
Oh my goodness. Number one, there's an awful lot of people already doing it, especially the Jane Austen fan fiction, and so the competition will be fierce. Second piece of advice is, if you want to sell, write Pride and Prejudice, because the other books don't sell as well, which is really sad. I think that's, some people will say, well, why can't I find Sense and Sensibility, books? And they are complaining because there isn't enough of that. But the answer to the question is, if it sold, people would write it. And I'm just writing the books that I'm writing that are not Pride and Prejudice. I'm just writing for my own, my own stubborn streak, where it says I'm going to do one, whether anybody reads it or not. And hopefully the audience will eventually expand beyond Pride and Prejudice. But
that is intriguing, isn't it? That there are some people who are so committed to reading just Pride and Prejudice stories, and if you're watching this on YouTube, or And you've got a comment on this, then please leave it in the comments. I'd be intrigued to hear from people who really are very keen to keep reading that same sort of material over and over. But of course, there is a huge market for Regency novels generally. And there's obviously authors like Georgette Heyer and people like that. I mean, have you read much Georgette Heyer?
Oh yeah, I'm reading one right now. One of her non-Regency. She wrote so many books and so prolific, and not all of them are Regency romance, but most of the ones I've read are Regency romance. Yeah. This one's a murder mystery that I'm reading right now. So.
Yeah, I read one of her murder mysteries a few years back. And I recently read The Spanish Bride, which isn't really a romance at all. It's more of a history book, to be honest. I don't know whether you're familiar with that one.
I haven't read that one. I read one of hers that was on other English history, and I can't remember the name of it. It was Wars and Kings and...
There's Lord John or something like that. I think there's a book.
That may have been it. A long time ago I read
that. Yeah.
And writing a book is such a monumental undertaking, and it requires so many hours and so much time spent that you'd be crazy to write something that you're not truly interested in doing. And so, I mean, people used to say, write what you know, but I don't know that's you need to necessarily know everything about what you're writing, but write what you love, because you're going to be spending a lot of time in it. I would never write a thriller with, a murderer on the loose, and I just don't want to spend that much time in the darkness. You know what I mean? I want to spend time where in a happier place, and that's where I go for my entertainment, is a happy place, not a
yes, absolutely. And yeah, and we have a lot of respect for anybody who writes a book and completes it, because as you said, it is a lot of hard work. Well, Shannon, thank you for giving me some of your time today. It's been great to talk to you and get to know a bit more about your writing and your process and how you approach it. And I hope that some of the thoughts and insights that you've shared will be useful to other authors as they look at this video, and to readers as well. So thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me today.
And thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, I hope the rest of your day goes well, and that your books continue to go well. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shannon.